episode of Off the Shelf is brought to us by Busy Bee Vegan Skincare. Busy Bee is an all-natural skincare line dedicated to healthy, vegan, plant-based skincare and overall wellness. They offer a selection of handcrafted body scrubs, butters, and washes that not only make your skin glow but smell amazing. Their unique all-natural scents include gingerbread, ruby grapefruit, caramel cake, and morning latte. So why not treat your skin to something fresh and all-natural? Head on over to shopbusybeevegan.com today. And as a special bonus, Busy Bee is offering listeners of this podcast a 15% discount on your first order with the code OrdinaryPodcasts. Thanks for listening and enjoy this week's episode of Off the Shelf. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Off the Shelf, the podcast where we take our books off of our shelves and into our hearts. My name is Julia, and wow, August? I blinked and she was gone. Who is she? I don't know. Today on the agenda is my final talk on Brian Selznick's Kaleidoscope. Although, to be honest with you, I don't know if I'll ever be fully through with talking about and thinking about this book. And for more reasons than just one. As I did last month, I'll begin with a general overview of the plot, main characters, setting, and of my overall thoughts. After that, I think it best to just dive right into the book's narrative and plotting, its atmosphere and its sequencing, some of its major themes, and its standout moments. As you'll know if you took a chance on this one with me, this isn't the type of book you can hover around the margins of if you want to take anything away from it. It's not a book that lends itself easily to being boiled down. I would be genuinely shocked if I get to the end of this review and you leave thinking, wow, I agree with everything she just said. I honestly don't even think that's the goal here. By its own nature, this book is meant to look a little different to us. And that means that it isn't going to hit the mark for everyone. And that's okay. If it didn't hit the mark for you, then, well, first of all, thank you for being here anyway. You're a trooper. I sometimes suffered through weeks of coursework talking about books that had zero impact on me, with the vague hope that hearing someone else talk about them would help. Sometimes it did, and sometimes it didn't, but I hope that some of my own thoughts spark something in you. If they don't, then that's okay too. It's been like 15 years, and I still can't stand Hatchet by Gary Paulson. No hard feelings. But that's not what we're here to talk about. Books that I was forced to read in school that entirely failed to change my life is another talk for another day. So, this is Brian Selznick's Kaleidoscope. The summary from the dust jacket for this book is almost frustratingly vague, but I say that only because I've now tasked myself with trying to summarize the book, and it's not an easy thing to do. In terms of giving us a good picture of what to expect from the book, the given summary actually does a pretty good job at letting us know that this book is more mystery and interpretation and confusion than it is straightforward story. It's rich and immersive and intriguing, but it's also confusing and overwhelming, and there's so much that I think remains unsaid. Basically, this book follows an unspecified, unnamed narrator and his close friend, who is usually referred to simply as James, through a number of different places, lives, and even realities, some more real and others more fantastic. The book is made up of small story vignettes, or fragments, most of which involve these characters, though they don't always look the same or exist in the same place. They are presented to us not as just multiple reincarnations or situations, but sometimes in different worlds and realities and timelines altogether. What I mean by that, for example, is this. Right off the bat, we meet our two mains on a ship headed who knows where in the middle of an ocean storm. The two lose consciousness, and when they come to, they find themselves shipwrecked on the moon and enlisted in the war between themselves and the sun. The story concludes with their victory, James being named the new king for his service to the war, and the narrator returning home to Earth without him. In the story directly to follow, however, the two meet for the first time, and we quickly realize that in reading, we aren't just being transported back in time in the lives of the same two from the last story. The narrator of this story is actually a type of giant, and James is a young human boy. And though the two speak different languages and live separately, they meet and connect and communicate in whatever way they can to foster friendship just the same. The plot is non-linear. The setting is unfixed and indeterminate. The characters are really the only thing in this book that come anywhere close to consistent, and even they are just a little bit different from one page to the next. Kaleidoscope is a book that asks a lot of us as readers, and not just in the way of many fantasy books, as in a suspension of disbelief. This one asks us to look a lot deeper than the elements of a novel we'd usually read for, the plot or the place, the people or the prose, and to see how feeling and experience and the way that those things unite all of us in our humanity can drive a book just as it can drive and direct our real lives. So, how do we make meaning out of that? How do we draw understanding from a book that resists easy explanation? I appreciate your patience with me today because I am going to get a little bit more analytical than maybe I'd like to, than maybe you'd like me to. Because this is one of those books for me that really begs to be deeply thought about. At the surface level, I wouldn't have understood it. And so I'd really like to do a little bit of digging. For now, though, I will start by saying that this book was beautiful to me in a lot of ways. I loved the way it was written. I loved the narrative voice, to the descriptions, to the way that the stories started to come together slowly as I read further. I think what was so beautiful about it to me was that it was so simple. It wasn't this grand, incredible, adventurous journey. It wasn't trying to be more than it is. It was just giving us the characters in their most honest state. It reminded me a lot of Aristotle and Dante Discover the Secrets of the Universe. If you've read that, it is a really lovely YA, coming-of-age, LGBT gift. I love that book. And there was something about this book, the way it's written, that reminded me just a little bit of that. The simplicity of the conversations, but the abundance of emotion and feeling in those conversations. This book was unlike anything I've ever read before, and the more I think about it, the more I find to love about it. I had to read it twice, and I still don't know if I've really gotten enough of it to really qualify myself to talk about it, about all of it. But I'm going to try, because that's all I can do. It's reading books like this one that makes me wonder sometimes if I would have been a lot better off all along not studying English, because I always feel like I need to be able to get to the core, to the meaning of a book. For a book like Kaleidoscope, I don't know if that's really the intention or the goal. And honestly, I don't think having one final singular meaning is the goal behind all of these stories. Kaleidoscope is so abstract, so experimental, and I think that what serves us better is just accepting the mystery and enjoying the wonder and the curiosity that it brings us. That isn't to say that there is no meaning or no direction behind the telling, and that doesn't mean we can't interpret and analyze and find what the words mean to us. But like in life itself, sometimes the meaning isn't just one thing, something that can be easily defined or found or discovered. That mystery is what creates our wonder, our curiosity, and when we come into hardship or difficulty, those things are what help us make it through. Give me crap if you want for overthinking and overanalyzing books, but considering the realizations and the philosophies like the ones that reading can sometimes lead us to, and the way that those things can change the way we think and live, I just can't agree that it's all a waste of time. When I picked this book up, I wasn't aware that it wasn't structured as one defined plot. And so when I realized that it's told more as a series of short stories, I got a little bit nervous. I sometimes feel like I can't keep up with short stories, me personally. Like, I just start to get my bearings and then they're over and I'm supposed to have already gotten to the meaning of it all. And I just can't do it sometimes. Luckily, I didn't get that sense from this one. Because this book is written actually as a collection of story fragments, I don't know if each individual story actually has something we're meant to get, for lack of better terms. It's okay that we feel like we're being tossed around a bit. Even though, as I mentioned, the characters look a little bit different from one story to the next, they are what drive the story. The characters, the narrator and James, significantly, their relationship to each other are the most significant consistencies throughout those fragments. And through the patterns that emerge in their experiences from one story to the next, we begin to see the bigger picture take shape. The book plays a lot into the concept of fate and portrays the understanding that regardless of the boys' various incarnations and existences, their fates remain steadfast and consistent. We understand that the two have fostered a close friendship or even a love, but that their chapter together has ended in loss. In response to their tragedy, the narrator feels and carries with him the heavy weight of guilt regarding that loss, in spite of the question of whether he's actually to blame. Once I got used to the narrative, I also noticed the patterns that emerged, replicated themselves in one fragment to the next, and those patterns almost became leisurely to read. The stories are saturated with sadness and tragedy, and so the last thing I wanted was surprises from them. The way that everything continuously fell into place was comforting in its own way. The narrative is, at times, a bit jarring, because it seems like every time something big starts to happen, we're pulled out of it and thrown into something new without any indication of where we are or how we got from here to there. I've read the narrative described as a tapestry, and I love that because of how majestic and ethereal it sounds, but I'm not sure that it quite hits the mark for me on describing the way that the book unfolds. In my own reading, I think it's better described as a mosaic. Each individual piece has its own uniqueness and its own specifics, but when we back up, we see that in the end, they all come together to make up a whole. In some ways, I think that all of these anomalous, strange splinters are actually trying to help us make sense of the same story. They reflect the many different ways that the narrator tries to make sense of his own grief. One of the questions carried throughout the book, mentioned in the summary from the dust jacket, is how we cope with difficulty and hardship. And I think one of its many suggestions is that we have to keep looking at our grief from different angles. We keep moving and shifting and restructuring our vision until the path becomes clear. I think that's what Selznick is doing with these fragments, is showing us a little bit more of the story bit by bit with each new reconfiguration of the details. I mentioned already that the plotline of this book is non-linear, but I want to go into that a little bit more and talk about what it does for both the story and for our reading experience. Traditionally, in literature, plots are linear in nature, meaning that cause, effect, and everything in between are told to us chronologically in time. Non-linear plots are instead all a little bit different, but by definition, they jump around in time or place, often using characters' memories or imaginations to portray the story out of order. These types of plots can be used to create tension, irony, and foreshadowing, but more often than not, they also cause a lot of confusion while we're reading. Some books give us very strict and very specific moments where we're jumping in time, and others just kind of let us try to figure it out on our own. They often feel random and chaotic, and they can be hard to follow because of it, but they're nothing if not strictly purposeful and measured. Our focusing too hard on attempting to set out the story in order to try to make sense of it can actually lead us to disengage further from the story, especially because I think one of the reasons many authors, Selznick included, make use of non-linearity in their plots is so that they encourage us to look at the characters, the way they're responding to certain situations, and to give us the ability to look back and see why they're responding in that way, because there's always a reason. In Kaleidoscope, it isn't just the narrator's memories that toss us from one place in time to the next, but their many incarnations, lives, and realities. One of the stories, titled The Library, directly confronts and challenges the issue of non-linearity. It illustrates the way that meaning can be found even in the confusing twists and turns that the book takes. But something else about it is quite interesting to me, that being that it also shows the way that meaning is always subjective and always interpreted. The narrator in this story is a boy who lives on an isolated island until one day he rescues another boy from a shipwreck on his beach. The narrator shows the boy his library, which contains all of his own writings, the one place where all of his own knowledge and experience can be found. He explains that when he writes them down, he forgets them, and so putting them in any sense of order is impossible. The narrator has lived alone and isolated for such a long time that it stopped mattering to him the fact that he can't recall any of his own memories. Instead, each day carries its own meaning, and that is what he lives for. When the other boy lands on his island, though, his entire life shifts. Suddenly, his memories, everything he knows about the island and its history, matters again. The shipwrecked boy grows frustrated and takes to reading all of his logs and organizing them himself, by his own interpretation. As he does so, the narrator describes the, quote, whisper of a memory that comes back to him. But I can't help but wonder if that memory is something in him or in the shipwrecked boy's interpretation of him and his memories. In the same way, we can look at some of the stories and illustrations in this book and say we've cracked the code on it, but we could look at it from a slightly different angle and get a completely different reading. We could ask any other person, really, and they might have a different reading too. What I find maybe the most interesting about it is that when a story is abstract or vague or confusing, when it doesn't just hand over its secrets to us willingly, there's something in all of us, or maybe at least many of us, that wants to find meaning, wants to make meaning from it. In that way, I think it reflects life, its ups and downs, and its twists and turns, and its secrets and its mysteries, and the collective want to discover. One of the other most concrete takeaways I got from this throughout the book, because it deals with loss and grief, is the way that those things, which sometimes make life so difficult and so hard to face, are most tragic in how universal and human experiences they are. From the multiplicity of storylines we follow throughout the book, we come to the understanding that no matter who we are or where we are, in what time or place, we can and will experience loss. Further, without realizing how widespread and common that experience is, we sometimes push others away. We blame ourselves for our own grief, and we hold ourselves back from fully finding healing, as we see from the narrator's own main conflict with himself as well as other characters. Something that the book explores, I think, throughout the many stories we follow the narrator through, are the ways that we might cope with our grief and come to heal from it, if such a thing is even possible. Going back briefly to the first story of the book, titled A Trip to the Moon, we're set up to believe that the book is fully fantastical, a type of portal fantasy even. But the further we read, the more we come to realize that fantasy is just one of the ways through which the story is told, and maybe through which the narrator seems to be coping with the loss of his friend James. Through imagining the loss as a heroic parting, for example, the narrator finds comfort, at least for himself. He describes the way that upon his return to Earth without James, nobody, not his parents nor James's, believe his story of what they'd both been through, and it shows the way that people can be driven apart by their grief. Although they're all experiencing the same loss, their grief each looks a bit different, and the ways in which they cope, or the ways in which they fail to cope, are different as well. James's mother's pain, and how all-encompassing it is for her, manifests partly as anger, and it keeps her from understanding that the narrator is hurting too. In attempting to relieve herself of blame and shame in not being able to protect her child, she throws the blame on the narrator, and it keeps them from finding community in the spider web of their grief. The theme of humanity's experiential and universal connectedness continues throughout the book, but the story I found it the most prevalent in was just over halfway through, in the story of Mr. Gardner. The story tells of a neighbor of the narrator, a quirky and intellectual man who essentially collected all of the world's knowledge in the form of encyclopedias, atlases, and other reference books, all for his ill wife. After her death, In his grief, he sets out to write the reference book to end all reference books, a book containing every fact, mystery, and secret of the universe, in one volume, beginning just with the word apple. From there, he realizes the extent of the task. By defining the word apple, that is, he has to go on to define every property of the apple, every association with it, every allusion to apples in folklore, myth, and religion, and he goes to his deathbed, still trying to reach the end of defining the word apple. The story illustrates, as James says to the narrator, the fact that, quote, the entire universe can be found in an apple, unquote. Everything, every person, every being, every experience and piece of knowledge and emotion is connected in our universe. And too often we forget it. Too often that forgetfulness allows us to leave others behind. When we hold on to that truth, that we're never as alone as we think we are, we realize, as I think the book's characters must, that fellowship between ourselves and others extends to connecting us in our happiness and in our grief alike. The other aspect of this book that really interested me, and which I've encountered in other reads all relatively recently, is the topic of the mental health of children, and more specifically of mental illnesses and the way they manifest in children. I want to preface this with saying that I'm in no way an expert on the topic. I haven't taken any courses or even done a lot of research into child psychology. All I know is what I can remember from my own childhood and from what I've since observed. What I think is really important to note, though, is the way that this book and others I've read really bring attention to the fact of mental illnesses in children's lives, and the way that this impacts their perspectives and themselves as they grow. By the simple act of talking about it, this book and others pose a challenge to the stigma that surrounds children's mental health in our society today. As I'm sure as adults we're all aware of, confronting our mental health or even just talking about it is scary, but the alternative to talking about it is worse. If we don't talk about it now, and if we don't teach our children to do the same, we do nothing to protect ourselves or them from the lifelong impacts and influences that stem from childhoods saturated by things like anxiety and stress, anger, depression, and grief. The narrator in this book is suffering from loss and from grief most of all, and he's left feeling like he has to deal with those things completely on his own. If only in his own mind, he's found ways of explaining and coping with his grief, but they don't always translate out of his head and into real life. Going back again to the first story in the book, we see the narrator's experience and his perspective completely disbelieved and disregarded by his and James's parents when he returns home without his friend. I think in this way the book also opens up a really important conversation on how understanding children's emotions and mental health and validating their experiences and their perspectives really go hand in hand. The stories in Kaleidoscope vary from being quite real-world to being quite fantastical, and the result is that it creates a space where different points of view, perspectives, and interpretations of the world and how it operates are all made equally valid. The narrator's experiences may at times seem magical and unbelievable, but we see them happen right before us. We can speculate that these are dreams or imaginations or otherwise, but we can't argue that they happen, because they do happen right before us, and we can't argue against the knowledge that they matter. And when we begin to understand that a child's interpretation is not wrong from the outset, however different or less experienced or less mature it may be than the adults, we reach a place where the emotions and feelings they go through while experiencing the world in the way we do are just as real and just as valid as our own. In the story titled Chrysalis, James explains to the narrator the life cycle of a caterpillar and its growth into a butterfly, and one of the statements he makes in the story was interesting to me because I feel it connects closely to the importance of upholding and validating children's perspectives. When the caterpillar becomes a chrysalis, as James explains, everything dissolves and then begins to reform into a new body, the butterfly. And then he says, I quote, "In the end, there's almost nothing left of the original caterpillar except its memories," unquote. Even though I'm sure we all sometimes cringe about the things we did or said or wore as kids, and even though we try our best to put all that behind us, Just like the butterfly, we remember, and thankfully not just the embarrassing bits. If we try hard enough to remember, we might find that those interpretations, those experiences, and those memories are still just as much a part of us as they were however many years ago. When we embrace that, we might find too that some of those interpretations aren't quite as silly or unreasonable as we would have ourselves believe. Speaking back to validating the ups and downs of kids' mental health, though, I've always thought about it like this. Kids' emotions are the same size as ours are as adults, but they exist in a smaller space. They take up more room, and they have less to face up against, considering the fact that kids' experiences are so many fewer and less varied while they're still young. So if kids seem to our eyes to be overreacting to something stressful, then our go-to should be not to tell them to just get over it, or worse, to grow up. All that does is tell them that they're alone in those feelings, and worse, that they're to blame for feeling the things they do, as the narrator feels he is. The best thing anyone in this book could have done for the narrator would have been to tell him that his grief was not his fault, but nobody did. And as I'm sure we've all come to know, grief and hardship and difficulties aren't things that any of us can just get over. Those feelings stay with us, they change us, but they should never control us. That's something that we have to learn and now teach, because it is what allows us to find community in our grief and to eventually find healing. Guys, there is so much to this book. I really hope that I've done it some kind of justice, for so many reasons, but most of all because I just thought it was beautiful. And there's something about that kind of beauty in a book that I can't describe. I hope even more that some of you felt the same. Again, thank you so much for your patience and letting me dig in a little bit and analyze a little bit. I hope it made sense. I hope that it didn't only make sense in my own brain. I hope that even if some of it was overreaching or strange or wild or didn't seem legitimate, that it made you think in a different way. And maybe even that it got you on the thought that this whole degree that I did for 5 years was maybe worth it. My real goal is to convince people that an English degree and the humanities in general aren't a waste of our time. They are the cornerstones and the building blocks of what make us human and what remind us of what it is to be human and why that all matters. As I did last month, I'd love to offer you a few places, a few reads to move forward from here if Kaleidoscope grabbed your heart and wouldn't let go like it did mine. Again, I'll be cross-posting this rec list on Instagram as well, but here they are. I think that one of the key conversations that this book opens up is the legitimacy of children's points of view and the way that mental stress and other trauma influences them. With this in mind, a few other books I've read, some less recently than others, are A Monster Calls by Patrick Ness, The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman, and The Nest by Kenneth Opel. I won't go into depth on any of these here, but I do encourage you to make note of and to look into them, especially if this is a topic that caught your interest as it did mine. Apart from that, if you enjoyed the way that text blends and interacts with illustration in this book, and maybe the way that illustration tells its own story, then I encourage you to, of course, try Selznick's other books, The Invention of Hugo Cabret, Wonderstruck, and The Marvels. However, I would also highly recommend just about any book written by Sean Tan, but most namely Tales from the Inner City and Tales from Outer Suburbia. Tan's artwork is absolutely gorgeous and intersperses the imagined with the real so well that I almost forget, looking at it, that it would be considered magical realism and not just realism. His work, his stories, the combined aspects of art and language make me feel like the magical could be real. Another direction to take in this vein is making the brave leap, if you haven't much already, into graphic novels. As a format, graphics are on their upbeat, especially for kids and teens. And although this means there is a lot to parse through, there are some truly beautiful stories out there written in this format. I won't give you any specific recommendations in this area, mostly because I can't, off the top of my head, think of any that relate quite so directly to Kaleidoscope, but I encourage you to give them a shot. There is so much out there, but there are some absolute gems just waiting to be picked up. And in just about any genre you can imagine, from memoir and historical fiction to fantasy and science fiction to murder mystery to action and adventure and superheroes saving the world. They aren't all Diary of a Wimpy Kid. Sorry, Jeff Kinney. I have to admit that I really liked your books when I was 11, when I was the target audience. But we move on. So, all of that was Kaleidoscope in a nutshell. I hope that my love for it didn't make any of this overly confusing for you all. Thank you so much for joining me again today, and we'll talk soon with a brand new book to take off the shelf for the month of September. Take care until next time, and happy reading! The Off the Shelf podcast is a proud member of the Ordinary Podcasting Network. To learn more about this podcast or the network, please visit ordinarypodcast.com. Finally, thank you for listening, and if you haven't already, please subscribe or leave us a comment. Thank you so much, and take care.